The wind carried whispers through Harmony Creek, but they weren't the friendly sort. They clung to the dust kicked up by horses and settled heavy on the shoulders of anyone who did listen. At the center of it all stood Ilara. She was new to the town, a widow who had arrived on the afternoon train just a month prior. Her face etched with a quiet grief that she wore like a second shawl. Today, that grief was overshadowed by a stark, public shame. She stood before the general store, her gaze fixed on the worn planks of the boardwalk. The town's self-appointed moral guardian, a portly merchant named Silas Croft, stood on the store steps, his voice booming across the street. He held up a small, tarnished, silver locket. He claimed Ilara had tried to sell it to him. A locket, he insisted, was stolen from his own late wife's jewelry box years ago. There was no proof, only his word against hers. But in a town as small as Harmony Creek, a loud accusation was often enough. The crowd gathered slowly, a silent, circling jury. Faces peered from storefronts, from behind curtains in the hotel across the way. No one spoke, but their eyes were a heavy weight. They watched Ilara, her shoulders slumped, her hands clenched at her sides. They looked from her pale, trembling face to the righteous indignation on Croft's. The silence was the most damning sound of Ola collective judgment, passed without a single word. Children were pulled back by their mothers, their curious questions shushed. The town had decided she was a thief. The shame was a tangible thing, a hot, suffocating blanket in the cool morning air. From the livery stable at the end of the street, a man emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth. This was Jacob, the blacksmith. He wasn't a lawman or a preacher, just a man who knew the weight of iron and the heat of the forge. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, his face weathered by sun and soot. He walked not with haste, but with a deliberate, steady pace that seemed to measure the very ground he crossed. He didn't push through the crowd. He simply walked into the space they had left open around Ilara, his presence alone causing the murmurs to die down. He stopped a few feet from Croft, his shadow falling over the merchant. He didn't look at Ilara, but his nearness was a shield. His voice, when it came, was low and calm, yet it cut through the tension like a fresh blade. "That's enough." Croft, flustered by the interruption, sputtered. "This woman is a common thief, Jacob. She needs to be taught a lesson." Jacob's eyes, the color of worn slate, finally met the merchant's. "Not here." He said it simply, a statement of fact, not a challenge. It carried the finality of a hammer striking an anvil. He then turned his gaze to the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the faces one by one. There was no anger in his look, just a profound disappointment that made people shift on their feet and look away. He didn't need to raise his voice. His quiet authority was more powerful than Croft's blustering ever could be. Let her be. A long moment passed. The wind whistled through the eaves of the buildings. Sheriff Miller, who had been watching from the doorway of his office, finally straightened up and adjusted his belt. He'd seen Jacob's kind of intervention before. It wasn't about law, but about decency. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet. All right, folks, show's over. Move along now. Silas, you want to make a formal complaint, you come to my office. Otherwise, you go back inside your store. The crowd, released from its trance, began to dissolve. People turned away, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. The collective judgment fractured, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. Silas Croft, deflated, glared first at Jacob, then at the sheriff, and finally retreated into his store, slamming the door behind him. The cost was clear on his face. His public spectacle had been dismantled, his authority questioned. Jacob didn't say another word. He waited until the street was nearly empty. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards Ilara. He turned and walked back toward his forge, the rhythm of his steps steady and unchanging. Ilara stood alone for a moment longer, the silence now feeling different. It was no longer heavy with accusation, but filled with a fragile, emerging peace. She took a deep, shaky breath, the first easy one she'd taken all morning. She looked up, her eyes finding the distant shape of Jacob disappearing into his workshop. She didn't follow or call out. A silent acknowledgement had passed between them, a debt of dignity that required no words. Later, that week, Ilara was seen tending the small plot of flowers outside the church. Her shoulders were straight, her movements graceful. A few townsfolk who had been part of the silent crowd offered quiet greetings as they passed. A good morning, ma'am, a nod. Its truth or falsehood seemed to matter less than the ugliness it had brought to the surface. Jacob continued his work at the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a steady heartbeat for the town. He sought no thanks and received none. It wasn't expected. Acts of quiet courage were their own reward, woven into the tough, enduring spirit of the frontier. Out here, sometimes a man's character wasn't measured by the noise he made, but by the silence he was willing to stand in for someone else. In the end, mercy almost always outlasted shame. Thank you for watching.